So let me begin by acknowledging the people of the Bunurong and Woiwurrung language groups as the traditional custodians of the lands we meet and play today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today we're talking about creative placemaking and tactical urbanism. I thought maybe we could have a bit of a sort of general discussion about those concepts and maybe, I guess, unpack them a little bit and discuss them in relation to urban play and, I guess, remaking, rethinking place through playful practices. And I thought we could have a few sort of questions about that and then maybe move on to some of the stuff that the Future Play Lab have done, but also the Place Lab around placemaking at the moment. So maybe we could just start by getting each of you to introduce yourselves and your positions, but also sort of tell us a bit about how your work is situated in relation to creative placemaking and tactical urbanism, and sort of, how you sort of define or approach one or both of those concepts through your work. So, Brock Hogan.
Hi everyone, my name is Brock Hogan. My title is Program Director of Place Activation at RMIT. And one of the key projects that I'm currently working on is called RMIT Place Lab. So you may have heard that recently. There's a lot of news happening out and about at the moment about RMIT Place Lab. But basically, it's one of the things that I'm kind of keenly interested in is kind of tactical urbanism and how we can take RMIT's what we call placemaking partnerships. So that's the Prominent Design District and the likes of the Melbourne Innovation District partnerships that we've got currently at the university, and allow those partnerships to act as kind of merging point between RMIT's strategy and local government kind of strategies and kind of approach placemaking from that perspective.
Thanks, Brock. And Quentin Stevens.
It's really hard. You can take mine. Hi, I'm Quentin. I do research at RMIT. Can I get this on?
It's not working, sorry.
Hi, I'm still Quentin. And I do research about urban design at RMIT, and I have a background in architecture and city planning. What I'm most interested in is play in public space, how people actually use public spaces. Hope we can talk about that quite a lot today. And I got interested in temporary and tactical urbanism and wrote a book about it with a colleague, Kim Dovey, at Melbourne Uni. And I worked with Troy to establish a parklet where people could play. So that's our experiment to answer the question.
Thanks. And Rachel Iampolski.
Is this working? Yeah, great. Hi, thank you. My name is Rachel. I'm doing my PhD here at RMIT on the ways we subvert public space, and I also work at Place Lab, which is really exciting. And so I guess my approach to tactical urbanism is really interested in guerrilla interventions as form of research method, but in particular, I guess I'm really interested in subverting existing built forms. I'm really interested in playing in the existing landscape and ways that can be sort of politicised through creative placemaking.
Thanks for that. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Leorke. I'm a sort of embedded ethnographer in the Future Play Lab, studying and documenting some of the different playful placemaking practices that are happening there. So I just wanted to start maybe by looking at creative placemaking as a sort of concept and something that we're really starting to see ramp up as things start to shift to COVID normal. So creative placemaking sort of looks to artists and designers to sort of lead placemaking from the bottom up, often through socially engaged practice. And how are you in your research and work sort of seeing this unfold now post-pandemic? How has it changed placemaking and, I guess, tactical urbanism, broadly speaking?
So I think what's really interesting, and I think what the pandemic has actually kind of essentially pressed the fast forward button on, is the decisions that local government
particularly have to make at the moment, are far more complex than they ever were, even before the pandemic, but particularly, 5 or 10 years ago. You have one plot of land that once upon a time may have had one family home on it and now has 30 families living in an apartment building right next door to a train station, next door to a bike path. So these decisions are really, really complex, and to make those decisions, a lot of the time now, you actually need research to underpin those decisions. And I think a lot of lessons have been learnt from the kind of community consultation efforts, previously, where a lot of local government got burnt through those processes. And so I think this has spurred on this whole gamut of amazing kind of placemaking opportunities, and they're far more creative. And I think local government is particularly, palatable to those sorts of kind of creative installations or interventions or activations, far more than they ever, had the bravery to prior to pandemic. And that's what's really interesting. I think, speaking of RMIT Place Lab, that's what we're aiming to tap into. We want to create the research that underpins a lot of these decisions, and essentially act as a kind of a front community engagement arm for local government, and kind of build on the clout that RMIT has with all of its amazing research and researchers to enable those projects to happen.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting to hear. There's a bit more experimentation and interest from local government. And Quentin?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the tools were already there before the pandemic, and so maybe the supply has increased, but the main thing that's shifted has been the demand. And we may all remember when we were locked down that the streets were empty, the parking along the streets was empty, the shops were empty, and people had to do things locally when they could go outside, and so that shifted the focus very much onto local environments and local spaces, and the kind of life that you could have in those spaces. People started to appreciate them more and realise the opportunities in them more. So this opportunity opened up to shift demand and behaviour and transform bits of spaces. So as soon as Troy and I were able, for example, just outside the Wheeler Centre entry on this building, we got permission to use a couple of parking spaces because they were just sitting there. Now, as a wasted resource, the streets in Melbourne are generally quite wide, and even this laneway had enough space that we could introduce new activity back into it. So the idea of the parklet had already existed for about 10 years, but the pandemic created this opportunity for much greater take-up of that kind of activity, and businesses, of course, had the need. Hospitality businesses needed more space to house their patrons. So there was a to and fro going on, very incrementally and very creatively, about where and how the use of different parts of the public realm would get used.
Yeah, we might come back to the parklet a bit later if we have time as well. And Rachel?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. Is this on? Yeah. I think the pandemic really accelerated in a positive way the sort of vernacular and understanding around creative placemaking. I think before it was a bit of a niche field, and it was, particularly talked about or engaged with by people that are, spatially minded, nerdy, like I assume most of us in this room are. And then the pandemic, which really substantially altered the way we interacted with space, public space and space in general, so confined and shifted, I think forced a lot of people that previously didn't necessarily think about space too much, started thinking about it more and started, and being more critical and asking more questions and demanding more of it, and therefore engaging more with placemaking concepts, either directly or indirectly, and there's more of an appetite for it now, which is really exciting. And I think at the same, in addition to that, I think the work from home boom is really forcing a lot of us to think about, well, what is the role of the CBD if we work from home, and there's a lot, like I think the discourse around it from the public has really boomed and nuanced, and there's more demand being put on our placemakers and our governments to do better spaces, and that's really exciting, I think. So now we just have to deliver that.
Sure. And sort of thinking about this symposium's theme, I might even start with Quentin for this question and ask how each of you define urban play and its relationship to creative placemaking and tactical urbanism. Is urban play a methodology? Is it an activity? Is it a type of game design? All of the above or more? Quentin?
Look, I think one of the great things about play is it can be many different kinds of things. There's no one definition of what it is, how it happens, who's involved, where it happens. So I guess even to talk about play is a way of thinking, or a way of living, and a way of interacting with each other and with the context around us. So that would mean it would be all of the above, I think. But particularly as an activity, I think a couple of things are key. One is the equal and open way in which people are interacting with each other and interacting with environments. So the fact that people aren't, here, we are defined as the presenters because we're on a stage and you're facing towards us and you are therefore something else, so you have an assigned role. And I think play is all about shifting those parameters, getting people to see each other as equals and to take turns, and to also engage with risk in certain controlled ways, so opening up possibilities. So I think the equality of play is a key thing, and that comes through into placemaking and even the engagement of local government into those processes of giving people new roles. But I think also the open-endedness is another key thing, that we don't know how play is going to unfold, and that's very different to the means-end rationality that I heard mentioned in the previous session. The idea that we know already what we want to achieve and we just have to take the steps to achieve it. The play has unknown and creative outcomes about it.
Sure. And Rachel, how do you approach urban play?
Yeah, well, I agree that there's many ways we can think about it, and I guess the framing I personally work with, I think of play as a form of resistance, bodily resistance, where so much of our city, we're defined how we use it, it's governed, it's policed for a certain type of use, and play resists that, whether intentional or unintentional when you're doing it. And so I guess for me, then creative placemaking extends on that, but is a bit more intentional, right? You're actively going to do it. Where play is a form of resistance that you do through the vehicle of your body. Your body is the thing you resist through. Then creative placemaking extends that to also include material forms. So, cardboard, wood, whatever you want, anything really, including non-material form, light and sound as well. So it's that, but with a lot more material intention, I suppose. That's just the framing I work with anyway.
Sure.
So I think listening to these two answers, I think it's an activity, and I say that I don't mean to reduce it to an activity, but I think it's an activity in the broader kind of repertoire or Swiss Army knife of placemaking tools and resources. Thinking about what place ultimately is, it's a network of visual, verbal, and behavioural cues that we're trying to form to in the local community to form positive net benefit and positive ownership for our local community. And I think urban play, ticks off many of those kind of items, and so therefore it's an activity or it's a tool to enable those connections for any given local community.
Okay, sure. And Brock, you mentioned earlier that local governments are becoming increasingly interested in placemaking and funding initiatives to create stronger links between what, in local government jargon is called economic activation and placemaking post-pandemic. I was wondering if you and maybe others on the panel could talk about what opportunities and challenges this is creating for creatives working in public space. So how are you seeing creatives respond to and becoming sort of enlisted in these placemaking initiatives, creatives and artists?
So I think your question is essentially the whole reason that RMIT Place Lab exists. We saw this opportunity in the market for RMIT to capitalise on its kind of urban prowess working across these different place-based industries. And what we wanted to do is create a platform for a whole host of our academics at RMIT, but as well as other contributors, to contribute in that way, and kind of riffing off something that I said earlier. 10 years ago, it was all about community consultation, and now it's all about placemaking, and seeing the placemaking industry evolve as kind of a next evolution from that is really, really incredible. And it's opened up a whole array of really quite, I guess, informal but active participant opportunities for the local community, and that's what's really, really exciting. I think, in that respect, the opportunities are endless, but it's how you kind of, at the end of the day, I think, package it up to reinforce those positive kind of community ownership benefits that any kind of placemaking opportunity potentially has.
Sure, and what about the challenges?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and something that we've made a really big effort with in particular with PlaceLab, is articulating it in such a way that it's essentially palatable and digestible for the local community. We want to, it's something that we want to make sure that if we're describing a project, it's something that everyone can understand, and that's actually a lot harder to do than a lot of people give credit for. So I think that's kind of a really critical. It's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. We have a number of copywriters and PlaceLabers working on the PlaceLab ecosystem, and the amount of kind of iterations we go through and how we actually talk about things and communicate things, and think of concepts and advertise and market and all that sort of stuff. It's really interesting. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah, great. Quentin or Rachel, did you want to respond to that question?
It's a great question. As much as I am, I think about place quite critically, I'm also a pragmatist, and I think whatever gives you the means to do what you need to do within reason is always, nothing to scoff at. And it's, I think sometimes we automatically dismiss this metrics of economic stimulation as it's kind of an instant red flag for academics. It's like, well, that shouldn't be the metrics that we're primarily concerned with. And I appreciate that it's a problem if it's the leading metrics, but I don't necessarily think it's an issue as an additional metrics, because it sort of just indicates that you've, I don't know, it's hard. Now I'm even doubting that. Look, that's a hard one. I think most of my experience has been doing guerrilla activation, right? Not asking for permission, just showing up, or asking for permission and being told no, and in some instances still showing up. And this year, for the first time, we've done it with permission. If there's a little render flying around in the background, that's the work I'm talking about. And it was through a city economic activation grant, and it was my first time working. Yeah, there it is. Oh, yeah, it's coming up in November. It's primarily a sound work, but anyway, and that was through the city activation program, and it was working with the economic development departments for the first time, as opposed to usually going through the arts departments, culture departments, planning departments, and it was a bloody delight working with them. It was. There was so much less constriction creatively on what you can do than I'd experienced in other sectors. So it's, I think we have to be pragmatic about it, and I think there is a lot of opportunity, but we have to obviously maintain, critical thinking about what we're doing. But I just think any means you have to infiltrate the system and do what you have to do, you should take it. So, yeah.
Great.
Can I just quickly add to one of my answers? I think one of the other challenges is actually going back to kind of Rachel's point about economic activation, actually quantifying the kind of net benefit of some of these activities. I think that's, local government assumes that, doing anything will have some sort of net benefit, but I think a lot of the time in designing these sorts of activities, you're trying to essentially justify the spend or justify the human resources that go towards some of these activities to your local government partners. and you're trying to think of essentially KPIs for a placemaking activity, which is actually really, really difficult. So I think that's one of the other challenges that we'll be facing over the next couple of years, particularly in the placemaking space, is actually thinking of new and clever ways of both assigning but also measuring the results of some of these activities.
Sure. That sort of lead.
I want to agree because I think that the impetus to discover new measures of effectiveness, if we don't want to use that acronym, that is part of what this whole practice opens up. Is the need to rethink that. Troy, could I ask you to go forward, please, to a couple of the images I added? Once this gets there, because I want to say something about some of the opportunities that local governments are discovering. That one's good, thanks. So this is actually a public square in a small city in Germany. So this is not run by the Economic Activation Department of the city. This is just the residents, some of whom are standing in the foreground there watching the fruits of their labour. So they just wanted somewhere for the kids in the town to be able to hang out in the summer. So this is the gym class coming and doing their gym activities. And as you can see, they turned the whole plaza into a sandpit. So in terms of investments, this was only done as a one-off. But then they realised, well, we've already made the barriers and we can actually just rent the sand or we'll get a donation from the local building supplies company. So the ongoing cost was actually very small. But because it was temporary, it was also low risk. So de-risking is one of the things that you can do to change the whole equation if you're talking about indicators and outcomes. But once they had done it, they'd also developed and demonstrated the capability to run it. And so the council actually handed over most of the authority to the local residents group. And one of them, when I interviewed them, said, it's very typical in Germany, everyone is a member of 3 associations. A local organisation that has limited liability and shares responsibility for getting things done. So they clean it, they fix it if it has any problems, they liaise with everyone, they informally police it, and of course informal policing is a much better form of policing than regular policing. And I think even the formal police have recognised that. So shifting all these roles and responsibilities around was all made possible by doing it in a very small way. And if we can go, Troy, to the next one, I think it is. No, maybe it's before then. I had 3 images. Go back. Go back one more, please. All right, so does anyone know who this woman is who's painting on the street? Right, Samantha Ratnam, who's the leader of the Greens in Victoria, but at the time she was a councillor in the city of Moreland, now Merribig. And she is there painting the road. She has a PhD in engaging young people in local governance. And so again, just doing a 2-week-long street party, as was carried out here in Wilson Avenue, turns into a now permanent park, the closed-off part of a street, and it turned from being a one-day activity into a much more developed idea about how you can engage people. So maybe it's a little contrary, Brock, to what you were saying before, but I do think that there's an important dimension of engagement, and it's a two-way thing, because it's not necessarily just local government wants to tick the boxes that they've consulted. It's actually changing all the terms of engagement and getting the other actors to actually own the outcome and decide what the outcome is actually for as well. So part of the idea of playing here was to test out all the possibilities and see what was popular and get the councillors to come down there and see it happening so that they would be convinced that the measures that they might have had in mind aren't the other measures, that the smiles on people's faces and people moving their feet is actually part of what you're trying to achieve, and identifying what new goals might be. So that is a big social game in a way.
I was thinking that raises a bit of a tension around these kind of projects between the sort of top-down government-sanctioned approach to these projects versus what you mentioned before, Rachel, the sort of guerrilla or interventionist or tactical nature. And maybe you can sort of, each of you relate this to projects that you're involved in, but how is that tension sort of playing out, and what possibilities are there for genuine community ownership over the kind of projects that you're working with, and possibilities for resistance and interventions into public space that may be controversial? It's a tough one for sure.
Well, I think that tension is where the most interesting stuff happens. Is that tension between, bottom up, top down. You can't really have bottom up if you don't have a top down thing over your head, and vice versa. I just think the tension's where it's exciting, and where innovation can happen, and where we can challenge and critique. And so, to answer your question, I think a successful, if I am answering it, is I think a successful project is where you're able to stimulate that tension, not hide away from it or pretend it's not there or plan around it, but push it, generate it, yeah. That didn't answer your question because you asked about existing projects, is that right?
Yeah, it's not really a question that can be answered, I suppose, but more of a kind of point for discussion. But yeah, if you have a practical example of a project where you've seen that happen, that's great. I know, Quentin, that's sort of a big part of the parklet as well, the sort of, parklets being somewhere between a commercial sort of extension of cafes and what the Future Play Lab is doing with sort of reclaiming public space through the parklet and sort of rethinking what a parklet can be. So.
Maybe, Rachel, you want to talk a little bit about your engagement with the parklet when we had it in Brunswick and how you played with the rules.
Yeah, it was this one actually. It's intentionally time-slacked, but it keeps working out really well. So this is Open Lab here. So it's a cupboard that opened up. I think the whole budget was like $300 or something. And it opened up, you can open it up and you can set up, there's a hills hoist you can set up to make some curtains, to make some quasi-shelter, some seats, some games, etc. And the idea is that it's mobile and you can set it up anywhere. And we set it up here in front of Parliament House on Spring Street. And the hardest part of this entire activation was getting the parking permit to do so. It was a nightmare, but we got there in the end. And then we also set it up in the parklet as well. And it was really interesting to see the different uptake from the different. We also had it in front of ACCA for a while and on Gertrude Street. And it was really interesting to see the different ways people engaged with it depending on the location. And the Spring Street was where we probably got the most interest, but the least engagement. People wouldn't actually, they want to come up and they want to chat about it if we were there. And if we weren't there, they wouldn't come up at all. If we were there, they'd chat about it, but they wouldn't want to necessarily hang out. Whereas in the parklet, it had, is that it? No. It had great uptake in the parklet because it was sort of part of a broader precinct zone, whatever you want to call it, where it was understood this is a space you can slow down, hang out, whereas it just seemed really out of place on Spring Street, which is what I loved about it. But it does raise this interesting point around, that we can't just, we have to condition people's spatial thinking sometimes, and it's
yeah, so this is a park that sort of travels around Melbourne to different suburbs and sort of sits there for a few weeks and is transformed through various activations. Quentin, did you want to sort of talk about the sort of role of tactical urbanism in the parklet project?
I think, Rachel, it's interesting you use the expression out of place. I think this in place, out of place tension is also an important aspect of the whole area of practice. And so we decided to do a parklet for a couple of reasons. One was that they were primarily or exclusively for hospitality business uses, and we wanted to rediscover the origins of the parklet as a truly public space in the street. But also we realised that the hundreds of parklets that have been put down all over Melbourne hadn't really moved around much, although that's really part of the whole logic. So being tactical is partly about being able to exploit opportunities and explore some of the possibilities and then negotiate around them. So we've certainly, I think, spent more money moving the parklet than we did buying it and kitting it out. But that movement, that transformability of the thing and its environment, tactics are about looking for opportunities, weaknesses, and exploiting and engaging with those. And to come back to, I guess, the engagement with local government, they don't necessarily have the resources or the remit to take those kinds of exploratory, risky initiatives on. That's not what their staff are there for. And it is challenging to work in with existing permit requirements and existing strategic plans and capital works budgets, and to say, how can we actually do something? So I agree that the economic development people, to them, throughput, right, is the issue, not creating and fixing things, but making things happen. So they are more open to, and also events. Most of our permission to do the parklet has been as an event rather than as a thing. It just happens to have a physical dimension to it. So that's what tactical urbanism is all about, is looking for loopholes or pathways of least resistance and greatest opportunity, and knitting everything together in a new way. And sometimes that knitting sort of lasts and things stick, and you get to keep something like a parklet there permanently. And that's, as many people may know, what has happened with the hospitality parklets. It was sort of by stealth that they've now become long-term transformations of the environment. Not because they met a KPI that was already there, but because they became a key performance outcome.
And in that way, the tacticalism isn't just the domain of guerrilla work either, right? You're being tactical even when you're formally allowed to be in the system. You still have to think quite tactically in what you're doing. So, you know, yeah.
Anyone who works at a university will know that.
All right, so here's a little activity. Someone who's good at 3D printing can make the little silver parklet that can park on the Monopoly board in the empty squares.
And Brock, I know a bit less about the Place Labs projects, but did you have anything to sort of reflect on about?
Yeah, sure. I had plenty to reflect on around the word tension in particular. But I think, firstly, I will just say I'm so sorry that you have no pretty pictures to look at, but I'd encourage everyone to have a look at placelab.rmit.edu.au. We have a very clever website that explains the whole thing. But, you know, Placelab is a super multifaceted initiative. It includes the fit out of 2 spaces, so 2 shopfront style research studios is what we call them. So there's one in Brunswick, just next door to Jewel train station, and there's another one in the final stages where Rachel will call home soon, just up on Cardigan Street, right in the heart of RMIT's future social innovation precinct. And then we've got the clever website, and then we've got 7 dedicated staff, so it's all kind of multifaceted, and there's plenty of tension all the way through all those things. But I think you know, when in the very early days, as we were kind of inventing the Placelab initiative, part of the reason that we wanted to go to Brunswick was because, you know, the crowd up that way are famously known for being super opinionated, and so we actually wanted to kind of force some of those tensions to actually take place, and we had a great launch party the other night, and we even got a little bit of heckling from some of the people going past on the bikes, but that's all kind of part of it. You know, we actually want to create some of that tension and some of that excitement around some of these key decisions that we're trying to underpin with exciting research.
Yeah, we'll look forward to hearing more about how those projects unfold. So I guess we're kind of running over the schedule. Did we want to sort of finish with a super pressing audience question, if anyone has one, or do we want to wrap up, Troy? Okay. Danielle?
Thanks for the panel. Quentin, so I understand from the German example that you gave that, in fact, the sort of the physical aspects of the parklet or the intervention that you see is only like the tip of the iceberg, and that really the thing that is being transformed are people's attitudes to public space and their role in their community, and how they interact with each other, their networks. How much research and I guess this could go to anyone in the panel, how much research is being done on that, I guess, subterranean level, or that invisible level of these kinds of transformations, whether it's in a community like that, or whether it's in local government, for example, as you say, where you discover like it's just so difficult to get a parking permit to do something, to get a permit to do something. Does that inspire any change within government to say, well, why is it so difficult to like get rid of one parking space for a few, weeks? I'm just interested in that, I guess, social and bureaucratic transformation that I think you're working towards.
Yes, as I mentioned, I did go and interview these people in Germany and many other beaches that were temporarily put down in a similar way. So I can say from my perspective about a book and a half worth of research so far, but look, there are other people looking into it. I think organisations are interested in promulgating, supporting this kind of flexibility as well, some of which they're learning from the corporate world of a teams-based perspective. So, Meribek is a good example where they have place management teams, right? They don't just say, here's the engineering branch, here's the buildings, facilities management branch. They say, we have a place-based group which cuts across all of that. If you want to do something in that place, go talk to this group of people because they can work together. They're not in silos where the traffic people would just say, no. Apparently that does still happen. They often do say no, but then you find a way of talking to someone else in the group and someone else says, that's certainly been our experience. And we produced a report from our experience working with the City of Stonington, the economic development team there, who were very supportive, and we're hoping, Troy and I, to continue working with them. So they are trying to make those changes themselves, and again, having external actors involved and helping produce that kind of feedback loop and give them an external perspective on what works and how. There is a whole body of scholarship in the academic world called actor network theory, which is very much about looking at how organisations of all kinds, not just including people, but things and places, how they coalesce in different ways in order to achieve certain rigidities or changes. So one of my interests in doing this work was to engage with that kind of thinking that already has existed for a few decades, and to understand that in the context of things like local governments, local governance and local places. Because, as is typically the case, the built environment professions are very, very much latecomers to new ways of thinking, I think. They don't do as much research as industry does, for example. People who make washing machines learned decades ago that you should have an innovative teams-based approach to problem solving and creativity. And I think they probably engaged with playmakers a lot earlier than the built environment profession did too.
Sure. Any other questions? Rob?
I guess slightly related to Danielle's question. I'm always curious when I see these talks about tactical urbanism and engagements. I'm curious about the sites that are chosen and whether or not there's any kind of orientations or commitments from anyone on the panel towards taking these things to spaces that are perhaps not Brunswick. If I think about where tactical urbanism might be most beneficial with someone with a community development and urban planning background, thinking about the outer suburbs that are so neglected when it comes to the kind of social and community infrastructures, Broadmeadows, Dandenong, Greenvale, where I spent a lot of yesterday afternoon at a family function. These kinds of places, I guess, are not so much a question, more just an invitation for comment.
Well, I can speak to PlaceLab. So, like I was saying, we selected Brunswick as a great place to start. PlaceLab is funded by the Victorian Higher Education State Investment Fund. So we got a pot of money, and we had enough to set up 2 labs. The first one in Brunswick that opened last week, we selected the site because it had amazing foot traffic. We had 500 cyclists go past per every hour. So it's an incredible location. Then our next one is in Melbourne, again, really fantastic foot traffic. But the intention was to kind of start with 2 and kind of demonstrate the model and essentially provide a bit of flavour around what RMIT is capable of producing in terms of short, sharp and actionable research, but design the model in such a way that it's modular and can be scaled elsewhere. And so we've already had some preliminary discussions about other locations in the future, and I will say some of them are further out, which is really exciting. That's the whole intention. And working previously as part of RMIT's location strategy team, I think RMIT is famously known for being an incredibly uniquely urban university. We don't have the same degree of kind of campuses that are kind of distinct in their own way. They're fenced off or hedged off, like our friends up the road. So it's kind of evolving that RMIT story and kind of positioning RMIT into either hotspots of industry or hotspots of community in really interesting ways. And that may take the form of a campus, it may be a place lab shop. It also might be something that's not physical, it might be something that's more digital or virtual. And I think that's the exciting future, some of the exciting tensions that we can kind of expect to see from placemaking as an action.
Quentin or Rachel?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it's not a good enough excuse, but a lot of the decisions with site are quite pragmatic ones. So it's working with council, working in areas where we know the council is going to be a little bit friendlier, and or working in proximity to our studio. Because for example, with Open Lab, our biggest expense, like the parklet, ended up being transit. So the closer we could keep it to the studio, the better. But it's not a good enough excuse. And I think, if I'm being entirely honest, we talk about it all the time. Within the collective that I work with, we talk about, we should really leave urban centres. We should really try a more challenging environment to work in, and we never do it. And yes, there's pragmatic considerations, sure, but I think, if I'm being honest, the real reason we don't do it is there is some fear that the uptake won't be great. That people are like, what the hell is this? Why do you have a random cupboard in the middle of a high street? What do you want me to do with this? And that's not good enough.
As a researcher, that's what I love to see, that kind of reaction in different locations as a case study, but yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, but and also a little bit of like, if we plonk this really urban aesthetic out outside of urban areas, it's not the best way to enter that kind of environment. But again, that's also not a good enough excuse, because then tailor your offering. So it's a great question, and I should do better in that area.
I know I wasn't trying to make anyone feel bad. It's just a lot of my career has been spent in these places where most of the city lives. And I just think it's really interesting, and it is such a challenging thing to do. How do you find a way to work in these spaces? And it calls for a very different way of working. We talk about different. I think it'd be really interesting to keep talking.
I think also there's this anxiety that if we're going in as non-locals, that we need to be working with at least some kind of local anchor, like one actor that is joining us, and we don't have those networks, but we could work on developing them. So yeah, that's a good point.
I guess I just wanted to say that there are such activities in outlying areas. We mapped the parklets all over Melbourne. I was delighted to find large numbers of them in strip shopping centres in Glen Waverley, which are also very lively, culturally, economically. But the contexts are different, and I think, to come back to something Rachel said earlier on, conflict and intensities of different actors and resources moving around necessitates intervention. That's not to say it can't also happen in other settings, but it is less concentrated and perhaps not driven in the same ways. But I think the underlying critique that you offered is correct, that areas that are already doing well get more of these interesting things happening. And the challenge for the workers who are out there in local government and creative practice in these outlying areas, the challenge is to get that going and to demonstrate to others that it's worthwhile.
Great. So let's wrap it up there and leave a bit of time for the next session so we don't go into our lunch. But thanks very much again, Brock, Quentin and Rachel, for your insight. We really appreciate it today.
Thank you, Dave.